In the 1800s, the Brothers Grimm, some of the best story writers of all time, wrote a fairy tale about a princess whose skin is white as snow, whose lips are red as blood, and whose hair is as black as ebony. We're talking, of course, about the timeless princess story, Snow White. In 1937, Disney would release their first major animated motion picture, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and 88 years later, here in 2025, they would release a live-action adaptation under the same name. That's had some scrutiny over the years due to bad publicity on Rachel Zegler's part. Now, is this box office flop really a disaster, or should it receive some praise where it's deserved? Let's get into it, obviously, with some spoilers. In the new live-action movie, we get more of a background between who Snow White is, how she got her name, her parents, and how the queen became the evil queen. The story opens up with Snow White being born in a snowstorm, and that's how she got the name Snow White. She lives with her father, the king, her mother, the queen, and they enjoy each other dearly. Unlike the animated movie that starts with a musical number on Snow White wishing for her prince and true love to come and save her, the real-life adaptation starts with the king and the queen and Snow White all having a musical number of the king encouraging Snow White to become a good leader. It's a very upbeat song. The town is involved. Everybody loves the king, the queen, and Snow White. But eventually, we learn what happens to Snow White's mom, and things take a turn for the worse. Snow White's mom, the queen, dies, and it's just left with her and the king. And the well, which was a wishing well in the animated movie, becomes more of a place where she connects with her family or connects with her past. The king meets the new queen, and she's got some magical power she uses to woo the king and woo the princess. The king and queen get married, and at some point, we can only assume due to conflict or war, the king has to go off to where he's never seen again. And the kingdom changes. We discover exactly why Snow White has short hair like she does. It wasn't because she decided to cut it off, it's because the queen, who is now evil and ruling her kingdom with an iron fist, she feels that Snow White is way too beautiful, so she cuts off her beautiful long hair. The queen conscripts everybody she can into military service and guard duty for her army or for her castle. And Snow White now lives as a servant in her own castle that her father would have left her. So that's the big background of the story, where we get to pretty much where the story starts in the animated feature too, past the text that we get from the opening book crawl. Now we get to meet the prince, who's actually in the live action adaptation, just the leader of the bandits. He is stealing potatoes from the queen. He encourages Snow White, who he doesn't know is the princess, he encourages her to stand up to the queen. She standing up to the queen gets the prince or the bandit leader chained up on the castle gate. Snow White frees him, and now the magic mirror on the wall tells the queen that she is no longer the fairest, that Snow White is now the fairest in the land. The queen, being jealous, wants to have Snow White killed. She sends a huntsman and Snow White into the forest to pick some apples, which is different than the animated movie where she goes to pick some flowers. The huntsman doesn't have it in his heart to kill Snow White. He lets her go, and she runs into the forest where, just like the animated movie, she falls into a pond, she sees some scary trees, and then eventually she makes it to the dwarves' house, or their cottage, whatever you want to call it. The live-action movie and the animated movie differ in this part, where the live-action movie follows more in suit with the Brother Grimm's story. She goes up and she falls asleep on the bed. The animated movie is a little bit more kid-centric, where she's cleaning everything and they're all whistling as they work. But eventually, the dwarves come home to discover Snow White. Snow White is actually not cooking anything in the modern movie. She just went to bed because she's tired from running. She meets the dwarves. She learns that they're really not friends. They all just kind of live together and they fight all the time. In the live-action movie, it works out because now she has to teach them how to like each other, how to work together, and now you get the whistle as you work song. All the dwarves start liking Snow White, but she decides that she wants to go off to try to find her father, and the only people that have an idea are the bandits, because the bandits serve the real king. It's information that you learn a little bit earlier in the film when you first meet the bandit leader. So up to this point, everything feels natural. The dwarves are introduced how they should, and by the way that the dwarves get introduced, you learn the dwarves' name just through the song that they do. Snow White finds the leader of the bandits, and the bandits don't really get introduced, except for one bandit who's like, I am master of the crossbow! They encourage Snow White to run. They make a distraction as the queen knows Snow White is alive, and she sent out some hunters to go hunt Snow White. Snow White comes back and helps distract the hunters from trying to find her. One thing leads to another, and the bandit leader gets shot in the shoulder. Snow White and the bandits take the bandit leader back to the dwarves, because one of the dwarves' name is Doc, but he's really a doctor of mining and rocks, not a medical doctor, but he helps the bandit leader recover. The dwarves and the bandits sing and dance and have a good time, but it's determined that it's better if Snow White stays there with the dwarves, as the bandit and the bandits go out to try and do their thing as the dwarves return back to work. But as the queen has discovered that Snow White still lives, this is where she gets her I'm going to be evil and really, really evil, make myself look like an old hag, poison an apple, and go have Snow White bite the apple. We return to the animated story-esque. All the animals go find the dwarves and help bring them in to help try to save Snow White. But by that time, when they arrive, she's already bitten the apple, and the queen has returned to her castle. Snow White is now passed out from being poisoned. She's now waiting for a true love's kiss to help wake her up. And of course, the bandit king comes and kisses her and wakes her up. And now she's encouraged to go and fight against the queen. The story concludes with Snow White showing back up into town. Everybody's loving that Snow White's in town. They're getting hope. She marches to the castle with everybody in town behind her. The queen and Snow White have a confrontation. The guards decide they want to be on Snow White's side. They don't want to harm or hurt her. Queen goes to try to kill Snow White, and then Mr. I'm master of the crossbow saves the day. You see the dwarves there, and the queen gets really mad. She goes back into the castle to her mirror. Snow White goes into the castle. The mirror gets smashed. The evil queen gets sucked into the mirror. She gets turned into black dust, black as her heart is. She gets sucked into the mirror. Everybody's singing and dancing. And that's the end of the story. Now, my wife and I did see this on the Friday night release, and on the Saturday, we went home and we rewatched the regular animated movie just to see what the differences are. And I've got some compliments for the live action movie. I've got some complaints, and I want to hear from you to know if you think that the movie was a disaster, if you actually went to see it. But I watched this movie, so you don't necessarily have to, unless you really want to. Now let's give praise to where praise is due in the film. The casting of the young Snow White, and how she relates to the queen and to Rachel Zegler's older Snow White. The young Snow White looks like she could be related to the queen, and she looks like she could grow up into Rachel Zegler's character. Rachel Zegler, too, needs to be praised because of her ability to sing, and she can sing. That's what all the actors did in this movie. They did an amazing job singing. We have to give compliments to the intro of the story, how they gave more attention to Snow White's background and her family dynamic, how she loved her family, and things changed once the queen came into the picture. A lot of the classic songs are still there with it, like Hi Ho, Stop to Work We Go, Whistle While You Work. And I do have to give praise to how they kind of tried to rectify the situation with the bad press that Rachel Zegler gave the film initially, how she's like, no, it's not going to be a movie about the princess dreaming about her true love. It's going to be a movie about the princess dreaming to be the leader that she can be. I think they actually did a good job trying to rectify that bad press. The storyline more or less flowed from beginning to end, and with the changes and reshoots they made due to the bad press, it somehow worked out. The visuals were appetizing and delicious. I'm talking about how they put the scenery into the movie, how they put the looks of the castle, the looks of the dwarves' house, the overall look and animation of the dwarves themselves, how the dwarves matched up with the design from the 1937 release, especially Dopey with his overly long sleeves. Dopey also didn't look like a baby too, which always bugged me about the original movie. And I do have to say, I did appreciate how they didn't make it look like the prince was stalking the princess, how we assumed in other versions of the story. And it felt more of a natural relationship, more of a natural meeting of characters. It wasn't a, you can't marry a man that you just met. It was a, here's a character, this is how they met. He's encouraging her to stand up, and then he kind of plays his role until the end. I also do like, after watching the original animated movie and this animated movie back to back, how they kept a lot of the same designs in it and kind of the same storyline of how she was there. She got out by the queen tried to kill her. She found her way through like a crazy wood scene, not quite sure how she's going to survive, and discovering the dwarves' cabin. The music was all very well done. I wouldn't mind possibly having the soundtrack at some point. And overall, the story doesn't feel dated. It feels more nitty-gritty, realistic than the 1937 version of the movie. And now let's talk about some of the flaws of the movie and some things I wish that they would have changed or made better, or they just didn't hit on the mark. First off, the CG. So we come back to the dwarves, and they did match up with the 1937 versions of them. Their colors, the way that they look, the way that they're designed, Dopey not looking like a baby anymore. But their skin tone and the eyes just reminds me of the 2004 movie Polar Express. I know we've got a lot of CG experience creating CG over the last 20 years, 21 years at this point, but it doesn't feel like that's been updated. There's been other movies that they look flawlessly human in other movies. I know this is a children's story where you're trying to update the visuals to fit in a CG environment, but they could have done a little bit their job where they don't look so fake. The story of the bandits just didn't feel right. You could tell as you watch the movie they might have had this bigger role in the story, and then due to all the bad press, they had to really scale back what they're going to do with the bandits and return to the story arc of the dwarves. I could have seen that the original storyline is that they would have come with Snow White coming in, not running into the dwarves. The bandits would live at the cottage, that'd be like where they live. And as the bandits went off for a mission, that's when the queen would have come in and then did her poison apple thing. But instead, they had to really rectify that and bring back in the dwarves. So the bandits were going to play a much more major role, and Disney had to resolve that and fix it. So we meet the bandits, but we don't really meet the bandits. We meet the bandit leader, we meet the I am the master of the crossbow bandit, and we meet the bandit that dances with the master of the crossbow, but just feels like there should have been more substance in the bandits. Like, we could have had the storyline without the bandits, but at that point we would have had a storyline where it's like 80 minutes of singing and dancing, poison apple, and then hey, let's rectify the situation and go confront the queen at the end. The only reason why the bandits still existed in the story more or less is because the leader probably can't be a leader of the bandits if there aren't any bandits. And obviously the final scene where the I am the master of the crossbow actually shoots the knife out of the queen's hand. I mean, at the end of the movie, you could have had the guard actually shoot the knife out of the queen's hand, remove the bandits, and being completely fine. What also didn't really make a lot of sense was the dwarves sneaking into the castle, but they also foreshadowed Bandit picking up the crossbow. Of course, they kind of hit it with the leader of the guard with the crossbow, and he throws it down. They should have left that out and had it been oh yeah, I forgot that the bandit was the master of the crossbow, and then he shot the crossbow. Although a lot of the transitions in the movies felt more or less natural and they didn't necessarily feel forced, in a way they're just there, especially when she comes out to meet the bats for the first time. It's oh, she's going to go find her father. Well, you didn't necessarily need to have that, but at the same time you had to have a way of building the story of her and the bandit leader falling in love or having a more intimate style connection. So you had to have a way for her to do something to show him that she really cares, and then he could come back in and provide the kiss because he's very sorrowful that she is dead near the end. Another miss of the movie is more of an artistic perspective from my point of view. As we're sitting out here, you can clearly see what's happening behind here. Nothing feels pastel, everything just feels kind of vivid. In the movie, a lot of the storybook features, like when they're in the forest, when they're at the cottage, the cabin, at the end when she's just waiting to be kissed to wake up, it feels very pastel, very oversaturated in how they colored everything. It doesn't feel as clear. And I understand it's more of a fairy tale. At the end of the movie, when Snow White is marching to the castle, she enters in to the city and everybody sees her like, oh, the princess is here. There's hope, and nobody really knows who the princess is. So it's like the only reason that they could know that's the princess is maybe it's what she is wearing, but otherwise she would look just like a traveler. But people knew like, oh, this is the princess, but there's no real explanation that they know it's the princess. So that doesn't make a lot of sense. She just looks like she could be royalty of some sort. But if it wasn't for her red riding hood, she'd probably just walk on by and nobody would care. But obviously you had to have your musical number. And then that musical number leads into everybody getting up. And then you have pretty much a line or two of women right behind her. And it feels forced, like they really want to have that as what's in the front. And there's not a problem about that unless you're trying to push an agenda of some sort. Now, the movie kind of feels like it might want to try and be a little bit more empowering to women, so it fully makes sense when you consider that. I think what I'm trying to say is it would make a lot more sense if the crowd was a little bit more diverse between men and women, instead of just having women in like that obvious first row of townspeople behind Snow White. Now, obviously, there's been some changes in the movie. From the I'm wishing for my prince to come save me to the I want you to become a good leader for your country kind of thing. And that was a necessary move for the storyline. And I do appreciate how they've changed it, but it makes sense. In the animated version, she's at this distress and she's just like, I am at this point in my life where I need somebody to come save me from what's happening in my life right now. And that's where you get the, oh, I'm wishing on this well for my prince to come save me. And then you get the modern real life version where you understand beforehand it's set up. I am a king. I have a daughter. I do not have a son. I want you, my daughter, to be a good, fair ruler for your kingdom. And at the end of the movie, it returns to her kingdom being very fair, being very townspeople oriented, where everybody's happy, there's prosperity in the land again. So it makes sense with that change. If you make that little change in the movie, then her not desiring a prince to come in and save her, and for her to want to rule fairly, it makes a lot more sense than what she was describing. What Rachel Ziegler was describing before the movie's release months and months and months back felt more like Joan of Arc. Joan of Arc was this female leader in the 1400s in France that stood up and she got burned at the stake. But I know if Disney tried to take Snow White and adapt it as a Joan of Arc kind of story, they would more or less get burned at the stake too. Overall, my wife and I did enjoy the movie. We'd sit there and we laughed when certain things happened in the movie and we'd be like, point out certain things to each other, be like, oh yeah, they did this, oh they did this. There's a lot of similarities between the original 1937 animated one and today's movie. Is it enough to justify that the movie's a disaster? To be honest, I don't think the movie was as much of a disaster as it could have been. They made artistic choices to update the movie to make it feel a little bit more realistic, despite being a musical and having to hit certain beats with it. The movie Snow White does make an effort of updating the storyline, making it more modern, and making a few changes. A few of them for the better, like the background of Snow White and how she gets her name and the backstory. How does the queen die? The queen doesn't fall off of a ledge like in the original one. She has an amazing death, and I have to appreciate Disney for that. Some of them for the worse. The bandits. But let me know in the comments below, was the 2025 version of Snow White a disaster? Or is there some merit to what they did to it? Was it a box office flop? Absolutely. Bad press made it a box office flop. Did it deserve to be a box office flop? Probably. But was it actually a disaster? I don't think it was a disaster, at least not as much as it could have been had they kept the original idea of having bandits and not having the dwarves. But somebody got the right idea to listen to the crowd and put dwarves in and remove most of the bandit stuff. Again, let me know in the comments below your opinion. Flop, disaster, not disaster.